In summary, I think that there's a lot of broken promises about the monsoon uprising. Muhammad Yunus promised the people of Bangladesh that there would be reform, and what we saw was continuation of bad behavior. I think this is a real crossroads for Bangladesh, because I think what was promised hasn't been delivered, and I think there does need to be an inclusive reconciliation process. So next, we're going to go to another online speaker. We have Sir Vincent Lin. He has served as the Deputy Ambassador with the International Human Rights Commission. He's worked extensively on international human rights, diplomacy, the rule of law, humanitarian issues, and has advocated for democratic governance. Sir Lin, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. It's both an honor and a privilege to speak before you today at Oxford University to discuss a nation that stands at a defining moment in modern history. Since achieving independence in 1971, Bangladesh has undergone one of the most remarkable transformations in the developing world. Once associated primarily with poverty and natural disasters, humanitarian challenges, the country has emerged as one of South Asia's fastest growing economies. Significant advances in education, healthcare, women's empowerment, technological innovation, and poverty reduction have improved the lives of millions of people. These achievements deserve recognition and respect. They demonstrate the resilience, determination, and extraordinary potential of the Bangladeshi people. Yet, of course, history reminds us that economic progress alone does not guarantee democratic resilience. A nation's long-term strength rests not only on economic growth, but also upon the confidence its citizens place in their institutions, the protection of fundamental freedoms, and the opportunity for every individual to participate peacefully in public life. Bangladesh therefore finds itself at an important democratic crossroads. The decisions made in the coming years will help determine whether its impressive economic success is matched by equally strong democratic institutions. Throughout recent years, domestic organizations, international human rights bodies such as IHRC, election observers, academics, and members of civil society have raised a number of recurring concerns regarding Bangladesh's democratic development. These concerns that many of you already know include allegations of arbitrary arrests, prolonged pretrial detention, restrictions affecting freedom of expression, pressure experienced by journalists and political activists, concerns surrounding freedom of assembly, and reports of enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings. Of course, at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that the government of Bangladesh has rejected or disputed many of these allegations and maintains that its actions are undertaken in accordance with the law and are necessary to preserve national security and public order. Recognizing differing perspectives is essential if we are to engage in meaningful and constructive dialogue. Bangladesh also continues to shoulder one of the world's greatest humanitarian responsibilities. Nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees, and that number is probably an underestimate, remain within its borders after fleeing violence in neighboring Myanmar. The generosity shown by Bangladesh in hosting such a large displaced population has received considerable international recognition. However, the prolonged refugee situation continues to create substantial economic, environmental, and security challenges that deserve sustained international support. A healthy democracy depends on meaningful political participation. Competitive elections, peaceful political competition and respect for opposing viewpoints are not signs of weakness, they are the very foundation upon which democratic societies are built. Critics argue that opposition parties have encountered legal, administrative, and political obstacles that limit their ability to participate fully in the political process. Government officials, however, maintain that legal actions are conducted within constitutional and judicial frameworks and are necessary to uphold public order and the rule of law. Regardless of political perspective, public confidence is strengthened when all citizens believe that political participation is open, fair, and protected equally under the law. Election integrity remains one of the most closely debated issues within Bangladesh today. International observers have expressed concerns regarding voter participation, electoral competitiveness, and the political environment surrounding recent national elections. Government authorities continue to affirm that elections have been conducted lawfully and constitutionally. Whatever one's perspectives, confidence in democratic institutions is strengthened through independent electoral administration, transparent voter registration, equal access to the media, impartial observation, and the peaceful participation of all political parties. Freedom of expression is another essential pillar of democratic governance. Bangladesh possesses a vibrant media landscape and an increasingly connected society through digital communication. At the same time, journalists, academics, and members of civil society have raised concerns regarding legal restrictions and the potential for self-censorship. Every democratic society faces the difficult challenge of balancing freedom of expression with the needs to address misinformation, hate speech, incitement to violence, and national security concerns. The objective should never be unrestricted speech at any cost, nor unnecessary restriction, but rather achieving an appropriate balance that protects both liberty and public safety. Civil society also plays an indispensable role within every healthy democracy. Universities, professional organizations, humanitarian institutions, women's organizations, youth groups, religious communities, and independent media all contribute to accountability, informed public debate, and civic participation. Their ability to operate independently strengthens democratic resilience and encourages constructive engagement between citizens and government. Bangladesh also occupies an increasingly important position within the international community. Its strategic partnerships with neighboring countries, regional organizations, the United States, the European Union, Japan, China, and international financial institutions place it at the center of significant geopolitical and economic relationships. International cooperation is strongest when founded upon mutual respect, national sovereignty, democratic governance, transparency, and respect for human rights. Looking ahead, there are several practical pathways that could further strengthen democratic governance. These include continuing to reinforce the independence and effectiveness of the Election Commission, encouraging constructive dialogue between political parties, strengthening judicial independence and due process, protecting freedom of expression while promoting responsible public discourse, supporting an active and independent civil society, improving transparency and anti-corruption measures, reviewing legislation that may unnecessarily restrict peaceful political participation, and expanding civic education. particularly among younger generations. These are not uniquely Bangladeshi challenges. Indeed, there are issues that democracies throughout the world continue to confront. No democracy is perfect. Even democracy is a work in progress.
Sorry, Sir Vincent Lin, we're
Yes.
running out of time. Wrap it
Okay,
up.
fine, yeah. Just lastly, you know, all these principles I've mentioned continue to be strengthened. Bangladesh has every opportunity not only to regain an economic success story, but also emerge as a democratic example for the wider region. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent summary because I think that the basis of the speech was about resilience and vibrancy in Bangladesh. And I think despite the challenges, Bangladesh has gone through some magnificent growth over the last sort of 20 years. Every time I go, it changes. So thank you, Sir Vincent Lin, for those remarks. Next, we've got another speaker from online, somebody who can come to the lectern. It's Advocate Mona Hagu Strindberg from Sweden. She's an expert in human rights and international law. Mona, could you come to the stage? Thank you. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me and my previous fellow speakers for the work you've already put into mapping the human rights landscape in Bangladesh since the political transition of 2024. So I work as attorney at law, and I have been legal representative for Shahryar Kabir, his international legal representative before the UN. I would like to use my time to do two things. First, to walk through a single case in some depth, that of my client, Shahryar Kabir, because the documentary record on it is now unusually complete. And second, to argue that this case is not an anomaly, but a diagnostic. It tells us something structural about how detention is currently being used in Bangladesh. And I'll draw on the recent Scottish Parliament motion on this subject to show why the structural reading is now shared well behind Bangladesh's own legal community. Let me begin with the facts. On the 17th of September 2024, officers from the detective branch of Dhaka Metropolitan Police. Hello. Okay. So on the 17th of September 2024, officers from the detective branch of Dhaka Metropolitan Police arrived at the home of Shahryar Kabir. As you know, a 74-year-old dedicated human rights activist, journalist, filmmaker, and author of more than 70 books, a wheelchair user with multiple chronic health conditions. He was not informed of the charges against him. His family was not informed of his whereabouts. This is not incidental detail. It is the first of several procedural failures that the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention would later document in full. In November 2024, the United Nations Working Group issued an opinion following a formal communication process that included a government response submitted in May of the same year. The UN experts' findings are worth stating precisely because they carry legal weight behind the rhetorical. The working group found Kabir's detention arbitrary under 4 separate categories of its own framework. Category 1, deprivation of liberty without legal basis. Category 2, detention as punishment for the exercise of freedom of expression and opinion. Legal category 3, violation of the right to a fair trial and due process. And category 5, the discriminatory nature of the prosecution. Findings across all 4 categories for a single detainee are relatively rare in the working group's practice. It signals a case where nearly every safeguard in the system failed simultaneously, not just one. The mechanics of that failure are instructive. Kabir has been named in 9 murder-related cases, most connected to the protests of July and August 2024. In 6 of them, he was formally shown arrest while already in custody. A procedural device, the working group, itself characterized as a long-standing bad practice, used specifically to extend detention without requiring fresh evidentiary justification. Shahyar Kabir's case is currently pending before the International Crimes Tribunals. The fact of the case is allegedly Kabir is suspected of planning, conspiring, aiding, and abetting in killing the activists of the Hifazat-e-Islam in Motorjil, Dhaka in 2013. The prosecution brought crimes against humanity charges against him. The tribunal is itself questionable since after 5th of August 2024, it is targeting only those who are either affiliated with Awami League or believes in the high ideals of the 1971 independence, which includes both secularism and democracy. The tribunal is specifically targeting those who are considered as a threat to the Bangladesh Jamaat-e-Islam and other right-wing extreme organizations. It is pertinent to mention that all the judges, prosecutors, and investigators are politically connected with the politics of the ruling Bangladesh Nationalist Party or Bangladesh Jamaat-e-Islami. Kabir's counsel in Bangladesh has filed bail applications on 7 separate occasions between September 2024 and February 2025, each one citing his age, his documented health conditions, and the absence of any evidence connecting him directly to the alleged offenses. Every application was denied without what the working group described as meaningful individual assessment. So we don't have that. That phrase matters. It distinguishes a court that weighs evidence and reaches an adverse conclusion from a system that is not actually adjudicating at all. Sorry. The human consequences of this are documented and severe. 2 heart attacks in custody, which Kabir's family attributes to medical negligence, significant weight loss, a transfer between facilities that appears to have done nothing to improve his access to care. Now, why does this matter to a panel about Bangladesh more broadly, rather than simply an individual, as an individual justice? Because the same architecture recurs at scale across a much larger population of detainees. On the 9th of July this year, a motion was lodged in the Scottish Parliament, which is worth citing here precisely because it represents an external non-Bangladeshi legislative body independently, arriving at the same structural diagnosis. So the motion records that 124 former members of the Bangladesh Parliament have been arrested since the transition. Of those, 140 remain in jail, 8 are on temporary bail, and 2 have died in custody. It further documents reports of denial of medical care to detainees, the misuse of anti-terrorism and cybersecurity legislation against critics, intimidation of lawyers attempting to represent the accused, and attacks on journalists, a pattern corroborated elsewhere by reporting of over 300 physical assaults on journalists since August 2024. more than a dozen fatal and hundreds more journalists facing politically motivated murder charges. What I want to draw out analytically in this, the same four failure modes that the working group identified in Kabir's individual case. Arrest without adequate legal basis, detention as a response to protected expression, absence of genuine judicial review, and discriminatory selection of targets appears as recurring, documented features across this much larger population. That is the difference between an unfortunate individual outcome and a system pattern. So Kabir's case is legible in this kind of forensic detail because it has been the subject of a full international legal process. But the Scottish Parliament motion and the broader reporting behind it suggest that the same mechanics are operating well beyond any single well-documented case. This raises a genuine question for those of us thinking about accountability in transitional context. There is a legitimate and serious project of pursuing accountability for abuses committed under the previous administration. Enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and so on are well documented and deserve rigorous, independent adjudication. But what we are observing instead in cases like Kabir's is something closer to what the Scottish motion itself terms collective punishment rather than individualized justice. Charges built on procedural shortcuts, bail systematically withheld, regardless of individual circumstance, and legal representation itself placed under pressure. That is not transitional justice mechanism. It is functionally the displacement of any pattern of impunity by another, with the burden of falling on a different set of individuals. I close the specific legal and policy implications, since it's ultimately what a case like this should generate. First, the working group's opinion in Kabir's case creates a concrete, citable precedent. It's not persuasive authority in the abstract. It is a formal finding that Bangladesh has violated its obligations under the ICCPR and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it comes with specific recommendations. Immediate release, an enforceable right to compensation, and an independent investigation into the circumstances of the arrest itself. Second, the convergence between this individual finding and the broader parliamentary and journalistic record suggests that any serious international engagement with Bangladesh right now needs to treat detention practices as a systematic governance issue, not a series of isolated grievances to be addressed case by case as international attention happens to fall on them. And third, for those of us working on the ground, as counsel, researchers, advocates, the evidentiary architecture that made Kabir's case legible to the working group is replicable. It's a template other cases can and should follow, precisely because a systematic pattern is far harder to dismiss than a single allegation. I will leave it there for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. I think the case of Sharia Kabir is one of the very important cases that's happening in Bangladesh. Sharia Kabir is a children's author who's been charged with crimes against humanity. Lots of politicians in Europe know his case. The Monsoon Revolution was supposed to be about reform and doing things differently. Yet really, as Mona pointed out, things haven't really changed. There's just been a change of those. It's like musical chairs, really, if I can say it like that. Yes, there's been a lot of horrendous things happened and a lot of uncertainty in Bangladesh, but nothing has really changed. No real reform. And Bangladesh deserves real reform. So next we're going to go to one of our online speakers. It's we've got Professor Tarun Kaitan. He's a professor of public law and research at the London School of Economics at their law school. Tarun Kaitan is a recognized constitutional expert. His research focuses on constitutional law, democracy, equality, anti-discrimination law, and institutional design. So we can't wait to hear from his expertise and his opinions on what's happening in Bangladesh.
Thank you very much. I'm a constitutional scholar, but I'm not a Bangladesh expert. So I speak as an outsider, but sometimes certain things may be more apparent to outsiders than they are sometimes to insiders. So take everything I say with a pinch of salt, but it's based on comparative scholarship largely. One of the key points of any constitution, one of the key functions of any constitution is to establish the priority of politics over violence. Any deeply divided society, any pluralistic society, and Bangladesh is both. It's a deeply divided society ideologically between secularists and Islamists, and it's an extremely pluralist society. For any such society to be able to make collective decisions peacefully, politics is the only way forward. And a good constitution is one that secures political action over violent action. What does that mean in terms of the content and the process of making a constitution? I'll say in a moment some generalities and then connect it to the Bangladeshi context, and in particular the July Charter, which I have certain views about. So comparative experience tells us a few quite clear things about constitutions that succeed in establishing the priority of politics over violence. And these general truths, I mean, you could get very lucky even if you don't satisfy them, but usually these things are essentials, which is that a system that creates permanent losers is unlikely to succeed. A constitution which has a significant section of its population, be it a political party or a social group, which has the political capacity to use violence, to take to the streets, and is politically harmless, will sooner or later take arms against the system. So one of the success conditions of any constitutional settlement is to be inclusive, at least of all groups who have the capacity to take up large-scale violence. And this is a condition of stability, not of legitimacy. Inclusion of all groups is a legitimate thing, and that's a good thing to do anyway. But if you want to be stable, a constitution has to include everyone. We have heard about the exclusion of Awami League in the current system. We also know that there were credible reports of, I would call them more than mistakes, of repression of the opposition under the previous regime, and the history of Bangladesh has seen many coups, many attempts where a system of winner-take-all politics, the party that comes to power does not accept itself as a custodian of state power for a limited period of time. It seeks to entrench itself, and that is the second key general takeaway, which is that constitutions that concentrate all of the state power in one party, one government, tend not to last. Constitutions, in order to secure their longevity, have to come up with a system of what Americans call checks and balances, and they have to find mechanisms within the existing system at every point in time to ensure that there are no sore losers. So the opposition has to have a genuine stake in the system, some voice in the system, if not power, and a real, genuine hope of getting power in the future. And therefore, any fantasy of ensuring that certain parties or certain sections of the opposition or the ruling party never ever come back to power is extremely dangerous and extremely damaging for a constitutional order, because democracy is a system in which parties lose elections, and that can only be settled if every group has a genuine and sincere hope of sharing state power once in a while. The third general thing I will mention is that a polity that has a history of extra constitutional change is much more likely to do it again. So it's a sort of thing where if you have a history of coups, if you have a history of the constitution being set aside or overridden, etc., then it just makes it more likely that that will happen again. And sadly, in the case of Bangladesh, we know that this is true, right? So the three take-home points from general comparative literature that I've put before you is no permanent losers in the constitution making process. So every group has to be at the table. No winner-take-all mechanisms, and thirdly, that the longer you can avoid extra constitutional change and stay within the system under stability, the more likely it is to last. What are the implications for this? I will be reasonably quick. I do want to mention that a lot of the talk before has been about transitional justice. I'm not going to say very much about transitional justice, but transitional justice cannot be one-sided. It has to acknowledge the suffering on both sides. It has to be credible. It has to be done by an independent monitor who both sides can trust. And calling one side's excesses mistakes and the other side's repression is not going to fly. So if you want a credible system which builds trust in the society, then the system has to be credible. It cannot be by a single side. Now, finally, I'll just say a few things about the July Charter. The first is that I think its proposals were pretty good, at least on one of my two criteria. So yes, Awami League was not at the table, and that was appalling, because a party that enjoys 35+% vote cannot not be part of the constitutional negotiation. However, while the process was flawed, the substance of the July Charter did seek to turn the clock on winner-take-all politics. It introduced a bicameral system which allowed a 100-member upper house, elected proportionately, to check the prime minister and the ruling party, which would have been a direct space for whoever happens to be in the opposition to be part of the system and to voice its grievances within the system rather than having the streets as the only option. It had mechanisms for more credible elections through a guarantor institution style of electoral commission and a constitutional council that Sri Lanka has been experimenting with, which were all very attractive. Of course, the devil is in the detail and how it would have worked out, but it looked like it could check some of the problems with election rigging in Bangladesh. It could preserve what was good about the caretaker government system without bringing back, without putting the judiciary in the heart of party politics, which obviously is dangerous for the judiciary's own legitimacy. Term limits on prime ministers were also a good thing. I would have liked it to go further beyond to federalism and devolution, because Bangladesh is an extremely large and extremely pluralistic society. It did not do that. But anyway, these other changes were good, and it's not, it's not an irony, I guess it's entirely expected that the BNP, when it was in the opposition and in a way sort of behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, when it did not know for certain whether it will be the ruling party next or not, whether it will have to govern in coalition, accepted the charter. But once in government, seems to have rejected it. And I think that is a huge problem, and it's a continuous problem with fixing the winner-take-all system, where opposition parties want to fix winner-take-all. When they come to government, they lose all desire to share power, and figuring out a mechanism by which, and this has to come from civil society demand, perhaps accentuated with international pressure, because no government in power has an immediate self-interest in restricting its own powers, putting checks under it. Of course, if they had a long-term vision, if they understood that it's in their rational long-term self-interest to imagine themselves as the opposition of tomorrow and therefore create some spaces for them within the system, they would do that, but our political parties tend not to do that. So I'll end on that note, that for all its other challenges, I thought that the July Charter was a reasonably decent document. It moved in the right direction, and it could have provided a breathing space for Bangladeshi politics to move beyond its cycles of violence, authoritarianism, and repression of the political opposition towards a much more moderated and inclusive system. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Professor Tyron. I agree. I think the July Charter is positive, but as we know, the culture and what actually happened on the ground, the promises weren't kept. So I think he's right as a constitutional expert that is what is in the Charter is pretty much okay, but it does need the inclusion of everybody within to make those major constitutional changes, you have to have an inclusive government, and it can't just swap it out and keep on chopping and changing in Bangladesh. For real stability to hold, the constitution is king. So next, we're on to our next speaker, which is Dr. Ashfaqul Alam. He's an affiliate academic at King's College London. His work spans higher education, research, and public engagement, and he specializes in technological policies and advancement. The floor is yours.
Distinguished guests, fellow panelists, and colleagues. As a semiconductor physicist, in a recent essay of mine on technological sovereignty of the UK, I had an opportunity to look closely at how our known world order is fracturing. The modern concept of sovereignty, established by the Treaty of Westphalia, initiated a value-based world order. Today, that order is under severe strain. The post-Cold War illusion that we could rely on a single superpower or on gridlocked global institutions such as UN or EU is rapidly diminishing. Faced with this emerging global order, Western democracies are undergoing a profound intellectual migration. Domestically here in the UK, even if we disregard the unprecedented rise of the Reform Party, we have seen liberal figures, such as the former Foreign Secretary David Lammy MP, advance the doctrine of progressive realism. It is a framework that seeks progressive outcomes, such as human rights, climate action, equity, while explicitly acknowledging, in his own words, I quote, "the world as it is, not as we wish it to be," end of quote. Internationally, we see leaders like Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, recently celebrated for his speech at the World Economic Forum Davos, mirroring a similar pragmatic value-based realism for the middle powers to navigate through this increasingly fractured geopolitical landscape. What this realism has triggered is fascinating. On the face of the decaying sovereignty, one Westphalian principle, it triggered the rejuvenation of another byproduct of the Westphalian Treaty, nationalism. The global North is realizing that to protect its democratic values, the technological sovereignty, it must turn inward and fortify the herd-bounded structure of the nation state. But as we turn our eyes to the global South, especially towards the situation of Bangladesh, we see quite an opposite picture. 2 years ago, in the immediate aftermath of the 2024 July riot and the subsequent political transition, I wrote an article titled "The Rediscovery of the Will of Identity." At that time, I observed a peculiar rhetoric emerging from the new political elites and the student architects, aka masterminds, figures like Mahfouz Alam, Akhtar Ahmed, and Nahid Islam. They began discarding the traditional geohistoric forms of nationalism as expired and obsolete. Instead, they wanted to build something called a civilizational state. First, they spoke of a Bengal-based civilizational confluence, but then they started claiming an Indo-Muslim civilization. This framework resurrects the old two-nation theory under the guise of a slightly globalized vocabulary. In that article, I uttered a series of warnings, or prophecies, if you will. I argued that civilizational rhetoric is never philosophical. It is a geopolitical tool. I warned against trading geographic nationalism for an abstract identity. Doing so pushes Bangladesh straight into Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. It prepares a vulnerable nation like ours to become a proxy battleground of bigger political powers. Today, those prophecies are real. We see intense domestic polarization. Our constitutional foundations and geographic interests are sidelined. Regional diplomatic relations are deeply strained. We ignored our most vulnerable borders for abstract pan-national and pan-Islamic alignments. And this brings us to the tragic paradox of our current global moment. The powerfuls are turning inward to fortify the state, while the vulnerable are being encouraged or sometimes forced to dissolve the state into regional proxy battlegrounds. The asymmetry is stark. The UK, Canada, the EU, and the broader global north are reviving nationalism under many different names. They want to protect their technology, supply chains, and borders. They know a state must have solid boundaries to protect its people. Yet, Bangladesh is doing exactly the opposite. We are expanding our identity into abstract, pan-national, pan-religious matrices. This strips away our legal and geohistorical armor. It leaves a small nation unprotected against the global power struggle. We are here to discuss human rights, inclusion, and democratic governance. But let me ask a fundamental question first. Where do these values live? Human rights cannot survive in a civilizational vacuum. Political inclusion cannot exist in a borderless cloud. Universal rights require a stable, legally defined, sovereign state. A civilizational state compromises democratic governance. Civilizations do not have voters. Nations do. Civilizations do not have constitutions. Nations do. Civilizations rely on rhetoric. Nations rely on citizens and civic laws. So, Bangladesh must reject the artificial civilizational will. We must urgently reclaim a historically grounded geographic nationalism. We must realize that our geography is not our limitation. It is our only shield and our brightest opportunity. For almost any other nation state in the world, I could have just finished my speech on this note with reasonable clarity. But for Bangladesh, here, things become even murkier. Now, yes, it is clear that nationalism is important, but in Bangladesh, the peculiar but inevitable follow-up question will be, which nationalism? The founding father of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, thoughtfully engineered, democratically evolved, and then constitutionally adopted Bengali nationalism as the natural civic identity of the state. We were Bengali nationals and Bengali citizens. We were defined by our shared history and geography, much like the Dutch in the Netherlands, the Irish in Ireland, the Polish in Poland, the Finnish in Finland, the Deutsch in Deutschland, or the Thais in Thailand. However, after his CIA shadowed assassination in 1975, the subsequent musical chair in our political landscape, General Zia, came up with the antithesis of Bengali nationalism, the strictly territorial Bangladeshi nationalism. In mid-1979, we, the citizens of Bangladesh, suddenly became Bangladeshi instead of Bengali. Imagine if one fine morning it is okay to turn the Irish into Irelandish, or the Thais into Thailandish, or the Dutch into Netherlandish. This is not merely a lexical issue. It is a deliberate dehistoricization of identity. With this stroke, the collective memory of the inhabitants of a land is omitted. And we already know, as Milan Kundera warned us, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. In the current turmoil geopolitical arena, this secular-sounding Bangladeshi identity has eventually become the pretentious middle sibling between the two-nation theory and the clash of civilizations. Though semantically amended, the remnants of this Bangladeshi identity cynically existed on all our identity documents, even following the 15th Constitutional Amendment of 2011. The Parliament of that time refrained from re-establishing Bengali citizenship as originally dictated by the 1972 Constitution. That was a major missed opportunity. Today, following the post-2024 turmoil, the arbitrary banning of the largest political party of the country, an absurd election, and endless public suffering, Bangladesh is indeed at a crossroad. From here, Bangladesh must decide when the time comes whether we shall allow this Bangladeshi citizenship a third chance on our passports, or we will finally prioritize our memory over forgetting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Alam, for that. I think it's a great speech about the global situation and the erosion of what we all sort of knew as Bangladeshi nationalism. And he's raised some very pertinent questions. Next, we're going to have a speaker, Dr. Rehan Rashid, my friend. He's a very distinguished legal expert. He actually studied here at the University of Oxford, and he works as a consultant in a law firm, Matrix Oxford, is that correct? Oxford, oh yes. So yes, he will be. I would like to welcome Dr. Rehan Rashid to the podium. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the organizers, particularly Global Center for Democratic Governance, for inviting me to speak here today. It is an honor, really. Today, I want to talk about the banning of Awami League in Bangladesh and what it means for its millions of members and supporters. My fellow panelists have already spoken about the broader human rights situation in Bangladesh, so I will not repeat. Instead, I want to focus on one particular fundamental right, and it is freedom of association. That very right is now denied to Awami League due to the ban imposed against it. Let me briefly explain. Awami League is one of the oldest and largest political parties in Bangladesh. It led the country's independence movement and governed Bangladesh through several terms until August 2024, when it was removed from power, not through any electoral process, but by force. In its place, an interim administration led by Dr. Muhammad Yunus took power. His administration gave the world an oversimplified story, and that it was all a victory for democracy, that a new dawn for human rights had arrived. An interviewer once asked him a direct question: has the Awami League been banned by your government? Dr. Yunus, his answer was, no, we have not banned the party, we have only suspended its operations. The interviewer, he looked visibly puzzled. To confess, I had much the same reaction as the interviewer. Because in practical terms, there is very little difference between suspending activities of a political party and outlawing it outright. First, through executive action, and then by an ordinance issued by the interim government, and later through parliamentary legislation passed by the succeeding BNP administration, Awami League's activities were shut down completely and permanently, and the party was banned under the country's anti-terrorism law. Its registration, Awami League's registration with the Election Commission was suspended. Its meetings, statements, publications, online and offline communications were all prohibited. Most importantly, the party's future is now tied to the highly controversial proceedings before the International Crimes Tribunal of Bangladesh. The sequence itself is worth pausing on. Due to the ban under different pretexts, Awami League was barred from contesting the latest parliamentary election. And it was in the parliament where its ban was finally cemented. In its absence, of course. So no surprise there. The one party that might have voted against the ban in the parliament, the largest political party of the country, had already been banned from the room. So let me ask you to imagine something. Imagine you are a member or supporter of Awami League. No, cross that. Imagine you are a supporter of the Labour Party or a Tory party. Imagine you are a Democrat or a Republican. Now imagine waking up in the morning after your party was banned. You discover that the party you have supported for decades can no longer meet, can no longer publish, cannot organize anything. Your party no longer can defend itself in public. It is the party that carried your country to independence, won victory in wars. Imagine knowing that speaking on its behalf could now expose you to prosecution. Imagine discovering that the organization through which you exercised your political voice has simply ceased to exist in law. Perhaps only then can we begin to understand what this word ban actually means. For Awami League's members and supporters, the consequences reached far beyond party politics. It meant losing the ability to organize, to protest, losing the ability to challenge anything at all. And for many, it meant living in fear of arrest, prosecution, even loss of life. Such was the situation. When Awami League was banned, its freedom of association was taken away. That freedom mattered. Remove it, all other fundamental freedoms will begin to crumble one after another, just like dominoes. Bangladesh's own constitution guarantees every citizen the right to form associations, to assemble peacefully. Article 22 of the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights takes almost similar approach, and Bangladesh ratified that covenant. Of course, freedom of association is not absolute. The question is never whether restrictions may exist. It is whether a given restriction meets the strictest possible standards the law demands. They separate the rule of law from the rule of political convenience. So measured against these strict standards, Bangladesh's ban on Awami League does not merely fall short, it fails at every stage. Anyway, there is one troubling development I would like to share with you. As you know, shortly after the country's independence, Bangladesh enacted a landmark law, the International Crimes Tribunals Act. In short, the ICT Act. Its purpose was to establish a legal framework to investigate and prosecute genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Going further, even from the Genocide Convention itself, most notably, the ICT Act recognized political groups as a protected category under the definition of genocide. You have to note that. But strangely, within weeks of taking power, Dr. Yunus's interim administration amended that very provision of the law. That provision was to protect political groups from genocide. The protection for political groups, that protection was simply removed from the ICT Act. Was that a coincidence? I wonder. Because from the moment that strange amendment to the ICT Act was passed, something fundamentally changed. No matter what happens to a political community in the country, from that day forward, none of it can, I repeat, none of it can, as a matter of law, ever be called genocide, no matter how serious the atrocities are. So here, I cannot help being reminded of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish jurist who coined the term genocide. As you know, he spent years studying how oppressive regimes changed their legal systems to accommodate mass persecution. I guess Lemkin might have recognized a pattern in Bangladesh, because since the interim government took over, hundreds of thousands of members, supporters, and leaders of Awami League have been thrown into jail on made-up charges, without any prospect of bail or fair trial. Hundreds have been killed, both in and outside of custody, just for their association with the Awami League. And not just Awami League members and supporters, even journalists, commentators, influencers, intellectuals have been thrown into jail, simply because of criticizing the government led by Dr. Yunus or criticizing its human rights record. And the list can go on. Now, let me move from the statute book to the courtroom. This is where banned stops being a mere word and becomes something people lived through. I'm sure some of you, I'm sure all of you actually know Mr. Hassanul Haq Inu. He stood trial, as you know, before the International Crimes Tribunal of Bangladesh. During his case, Mr. Inu's own defense lawyers tried to introduce evidence that July 2024 was not the single clean story the interim government insisted on telling. And because of that, prosecutors of the International Crimes Tribunal threatened the defense team lawyers with sedition charges. As you know, you already know that in Bangladesh, sedition carries the death penalty. Imagine a lawyer doing a lawyer's job threatened with execution for simply asking a tribunal to consider more than one version of events. That is not how a courtroom should function, period. So such a legal climate has a direct bearing on Awami League's ban, because Awami League, as an organization that is legally prevented from functioning, cannot simply answer for itself in such a legal framework. And a legal system where pleading facts becomes a crime is certainly not protecting the rule of law. Please note, we are talking about the same controversial ICT that also issued death sentence against Awami League President Sheikh Hasina. And that particular verdict has been roundly criticized by a number of human rights groups around the world. This is not merely about the Awami League. It is about the millions of citizens who choose to associate with it. Whether you supported the Awami League or opposed it is beside the point, as my friend Chris was saying at the beginning of today's event. Can a state still call itself pluralistic or democratic after criminalizing the country's largest political party? No. The interim regime and the BNP administration have consistently maintained that the ban of Awami League was necessary to restore democracy. This argument is simply untenable, because democracy cannot be achieved by dismantling democratic participation of millions. One day, history will reach its own judgment on Bangladesh, but history will be written tomorrow. Our responsibility begins today. And it is the measure by which all of us, sooner or later, will be judged. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Rehan Rashid. Last but not least, we have our last speaker online. I don't really know how to introduce him. I think everybody knows him as Joy, but as we're in a formal setting.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate the introduction and hosting this event. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone at Oxford. I appreciate this opportunity and for having me. As Chris pointed out, introducing me is a little challenging, but I would like to start by saying, on that note, and as to what I myself have had to face, you've heard the stories from the families of some of the victims, our former Chief Justice, human rights activists. Just like them, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of not just Awami League politicians, but also journalists, editors, media owners who were not involved in politics, not involved in government, yet they remain behind bars for over 2 years now, everyone charged with murder. I am not, I hold no office in the Awami League. I'm simply a member. I held no position in the government other than being the honorary advisor for information technology. And I ran the Awami League's election campaign media department, if you will. I set that up and I ran that. I have lived abroad almost my entire life. I have lived here in the US for almost 30 years. And in 2024, I had only been to Bangladesh once for about a week to 10 days, which was in April. Yet I have been charged, and again, this is from what I've heard in the media, because I have received nothing from any courts or government or any notice whatsoever. I have been charged with murder during the July riots when I was 8,000 miles away. I have been charged with genocide for approving the shutdown of the internet upon instruction from the Prime Minister, from my mother, which I tried to push back against for as long as I could until the situation had gotten out of control. But a lot of what happened in Bangladesh at the time was standard operating procedure for many governments when a situation gets that violent. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of that. But what you're seeing now, since then, you're seeing this red herring and a huge cover-up. The Awami League is being blamed. The Awami League is being blamed for deaths. And unfortunately, many credible international groups and organizations are providing that cover. And that is what is deeply disturbing right now. It starts with the UN report, and I want to tackle that head on. The UN report unequivocally blames the Awami League government for the deaths of 1,400 people, 1,400. However, at the same time, the Yunus regime's own count is 834. To this day, now our lawyers have written to the United Nations again and again, asking for the list of names of the 1,400 victims. We have not heard back at all. There has been no response. So first of all, you have the government in Bangladesh itself, the Yunus government, only claiming 834 deaths or 836, something like that, but the UN claiming 1,400. Even if you look at those figures, there were at least 44, the UN acknowledges 44 police officers killed. The actual number is probably far higher because so many are still missing. You have hundreds of Awami League activists and leaders that were killed during that period. Forget about the period after, because the UN report only covers the period from July 15th to August 15th. There, as you've heard from some of the other speakers, there have been hundreds of deaths since, including in judicial custody. Yet, all of these deaths are blamed on the government. The one thing no one talks about, a couple of the speakers here have brought it up, but when I have spoken with many of these international organizations, the one thing that none of them have an answer to is the indemnity ordinance that was issued by the Yunus government. How can you, why was it necessary? Why was it necessary to pass a law indemnifying protesters from all killings? If they weren't responsible for any killings, why was that necessary? So the indemnity ordinance itself is admission from the Yunus regime and the protest leaders that they killed people. They killed police officers. They killed Awami League activists. Otherwise, the indemnity ordinance would not have been necessary at all. So just to blame the Awami League is a red herring. And then, we've talked about the human rights situation in Bangladesh, that things weren't perfect in the past. Without a doubt, they were not, even under our government. But if you're going to indemnify the killing of political activists, police officers, if you're going to indemnify the killings of hundreds, if you're going to ignore the continued killing of Awami League activists and leaders, if you're going to ignore extrajudicial killings in custody, both during the Yunus regime and ongoing, then why blame the Awami League? If this is acceptable, if these deaths are all legal, if the killings of police officers and Awami League activists is legal, then why blame the Awami League at all? What you have instead, and another thing that the Awami League was blamed for were the elections, that they were controversial. And yet you had recently an election in Bangladesh where the largest political party, with almost half the voters in the country, has been completely banned, not allowed to conduct any political activity, and the elections rubber stamped. We have enough cell phone recorded footage of election manipulation, election rigging, ballot boxes being stuffed in the middle of the night. And you've had all of these international organizations provide a cover for this. They have accepted the elections. They have merely mentioned the banning of the largest political party as a slight footnote, that it did not affect the outcome of what would happen in Bangladesh. Now, such mechanisms, such cover-ups are sustainable for a short time. They're sustainable in the short run, but they're never sustainable in the long term. What you had during the 2 years of the Yunus regime was completely unconstitutional. This was an unelected government. This was an unelected regime that seized power. What they tried to do, what they tried to have, and what they call it a revolution. A revolution is a takeover of power, an overthrow where you seize power and rewrite your own rules. But they were not able to do that. So then they tried to run under the cover of an interim government, which there is no such thing in any constitution. certainly not in the Bangladesh constitution. They amended laws, including passing the indemnity law, indemnifying protesters, as well as amending the laws that create and govern the International Crimes Tribunal to allow them to go after political parties, political actors, and hold people without bail indefinitely. None of this did they have the authority to do. They did not have the constitutional or legal authority to do. It was for a future parliament to be ratified, which in itself is a joke. And the BNP, for all their promises of change, reform, what did they do? This was something I privately had predicted with most of our leaders and activists, that no, the BNP is not going to do any of that. Once they're in power, they are going to consolidate their power. They ratified all these amendments. Why? Because they did not have to take the blame for banning the Awami League. That blame passed on to Yunus, and Yunus was no longer in power. They were simply continuing it. It made it easy for them. The BNP had sent a delegation to Washington, D.C., where I live. They did their level best to convince the United States State Department to uphold the ban to allow elections in Bangladesh without the Awami League. Why? Because they wanted to win a two-thirds majority, which is a majority to be able to amend the Constitution as they wish, which if the Awami League had participated in the elections, the BNP would never have on its own. That is what happened. That was the plan. And it is going swimmingly. However, as we've heard from constitutional experts, again, these things are sustainable for a while. They're never sustainable in the long term. What does the future hold? Yes, the Awami League is banned, but it still enjoys the support of at least 40% of the country. And as the BNP's governance failures continue and increase, as lawlessness continues and increases, and as the persecution of the Awami League continues, what do you think this 40% of the population is going to do? Does anyone believe that they're going to simply slowly forget about the Awami League and give up? We're talking of a country of 170 million people. 40% of the population is somewhere around 60 million people. Are they going to forget? Are they going to give up? No, that won't happen. What you have in Bangladesh's future right now, with this cover-up, with these extra constitutional acts, with the Constitution being disregarded, no rule of law, you have two certainties in Bangladesh. One, that every government, whether it's the Awami League in the future or not, any politician is only going to think short term, that I have 5 years to do whatever I want, make as much money as I want, get as much revenge as I want, and then I am out. Number two, political retribution, this politics of retribution that was brought in by Yunus and Jamaat-e-Islam, this is guaranteed to continue. 100%. Whether the Awami League will come back, someone else will come, there will be constant political retribution. And as we heard from our constitutional expert, what is the most likely final scenario in that case? At some point in the future, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, Bangladesh will most likely end up in a civil war. That is the most likely scenario that is facing Bangladesh today. The only way to stop that future is for international powers to stop covering up the violations, the extra-constitutional mechanisms, the human rights abuses, the killings, the indemnification of killings, is to act against that, and the time to act against that is now. There will be elections in a few years. However, the BNP, with its 2/3 majority, will, I am sure, make several amendments to the constitutions to guarantee that the elections are rigged in their favor, that they stay in power. They will attempt that. Whether that will succeed or not is another story. And in the meantime, the Awami League supporters and activists, as they're pushed deeper underground, as their backs are pushed harder against the wall, eventually it will reach a boiling point. This is not sustainable. So the only option really, if human rights are to be upheld, if democracy is to be upheld, if stability is to be upheld, is for the international community to step in now, acknowledge the atrocities of the last 2 years. If you're going to demand justice, justice has to be demanded for all. Justice must be equal. One-sided justice is not justice. And the last thing I would like to address, which has been brought up, is about the future. How can there be reconciliation? And there was mention of the July Charter. It is true, there were some excellent ideas in the July Charter. Bangladesh, without a doubt, needs more checks and balances. However, the fundamental flaw which made the July Charter unsustainable was that it left out, again, not just the largest political party, but all progressive parties. All progressive liberal political parties in Bangladesh were left out of the July Charter discussions altogether. This was a very one-sided charter, and even if by any chance the BNP had adopted it, it would have been rejected by half the population, the supporters of half the political parties in the country, and it would not have been sustainable because it would have been seen as unfair and one-sided. Change, reform cannot be imposed. It will not be sustainable. It must be done with the will of the people, with the will of the majority of the people in an inclusive way. I'm not talking about fringe parties like Jamaat-e-Islam, who the reality is Jamaat has never polled more than 3 to 10% in Bangladesh. They do not represent a mainstream political party in Bangladesh. And because of their history, because of the genocide, their actions during our liberation war, the majority of the country hates them. Even majority of BNP supporters hate Jamaat. What you're seeing now is political expediency. On that note, I would like to conclude my comments, my remarks, and thank you again to all the organizers and to Chris Blackburn for hosting this. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joy. He's left us with some really stark choices, like what is going to happen with Bangladesh's future? Will there be reconciliation? I hope so, because if there isn't, I'd hate to see what's going to happen. You can't just marginalize millions of people in Bangladesh. So thank you to all distinguished speakers. Thank you for attending here. It's been quite a hot but a really good discussion. And thank you to all those at home. We were going to have question and answers, but unfortunately we've run out of time and we've gone over slightly. My timekeeping's to blame. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.
হ্যালো হ্যালো আস্তে 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 সব বাড়াইয়া দেবে আগে আস্তে আস্তে সব বাড়াইয়া দেবে থ্যাংক ইউ সবরে আমাদের রুমটা চেঞ্জ হবে আপনারা সবাই আস্তে আস্তে চলে যাবেন প্লিজ